Facebook group gives one woman the courage to go to the police and tell them a member of the religious organization she grew up in sexually assaulted her. The Washington Post recently published an investigation into People of Praise, which has connections to Supreme Court Justice Amy Coney Barrett. Investigative reporter Beth Reinhard co-wrote the piece, and she joins us now to talk about this. So Beth, let's start out with just sort of the basics for people who don't know. Explain what People of Praise is and what they do.
So this is a Christian group that emerged in the early 70s. It's small. There's about 1,700 members, they say, across the country. And they practice communal living. They gather on Sundays. They run some schools, 3 schools across the country. And they practice something called headship, in which the man, is the head of the household. He is the head to his wife, and that means he is the key advisor to her on matters of religion, but also secular matters. Women, before they are married, have female advisors, but when they once they are married, their head becomes their husband. And so it has this hierarchy. The leadership of the organization is all male.
So the investigation focuses on allegations of sexual assault by a particular teacher at the school. And it almost seemed to me when I was reading this that, first of all, there was not a sense of urgency. But also it was almost like, because of that lack of sense of urgency, they were sort of running out the clock. Eventually the teacher leaves the school, and then they sort of say, well, he's left the school. But can you just talk about how this investigation started and where it stands?
So after Amy Coney Barrett's nomination to the Supreme Court last year, a number of people who were raised in this community, including the woman you're referring to who accused her teacher of molesting her, were sort of activated. They hadn't really come to terms with the abuse they had suffered, and her rising profile made them do a lot of thinking about the way they had been raised, what happened to them as kids, and the way, in some cases, community leaders had handled their allegations of abuse. And they sort of found each other, as folks do these days, on Facebook. And as a result, one of them went public with her story in The Guardian. And the organization responded, hired a law firm. They ended up hiring another law firm once other people came forward with their reports of abuse, and they now are, asking members who have any such allegations to come forward, talk to these lawyers, and they say they're going to be examining these claims and, possibly instituting some kind of reforms.
So, have any charges been filed against that teacher, Dave Beskar?
So the woman, the former student, her name is Katie Logan. She says he molested her just 2 weeks after her graduation from high school. She came forward for the first time publicly in my story, but she had also gone to the police in late December, actually on New Year's Eve. She decided to make the decision to go to police, and they did investigate, and they did recommend charges. However, prosecutors decided not to charge him. They told me that the statute of limitations and the way the law was written in 2001, which is when this allegedly happened, precluded them from bringing charges. He, as of 2015, was serving as the headmaster of another Christian school, not a People of Praise school, in Minneapolis, and was put on indefinite leave shortly before the story was published.
So you talked about this Facebook group, basically, of people supporting each other who have been a part of this church, and they told you all kinds of stories. This teacher is one thing, but you spoke to a number of women and one man. What did they tell you about their experiences?
So, you know, each experience, of course, is unique. Some of the people I talked to had been molested by someone in their family. In a couple of the cases, women had been abused by someone living with their family in household, which is the term that the group uses for when a single person lives with a family. That's the communal living I referred to earlier. The idea behind that is, you know, that they see how a family operates, they can offer support and help. And a couple of the women I talked to who you see in that picture, Rebecca Grundhofer and Sarah Kuehl, who are on the left and the right, they were molested as children by someone who was living in household with them. I should mention that at the time of the abuse, there was not a People of Praise chapter in the Minneapolis area where they lived. They were part of sort of a precursor group that later joined People of Praise.
So just so our audience understands, what exactly are the connections between Supreme Court Justice Amy Coney Barrett and this group?
So to be clear, she didn't have any direct lines to the claims that we wrote about, but she was raised in People of Praise in Louisiana. That's where she grew up. She went to law school in Indiana, which is where the group is headquartered, and became very active in the branch there. She at one time lived with one of the co-founders. She had a leadership position in the group as a female advisor. At that time, they were known as handmaids. And she also served on the board that oversees these schools that I mentioned earlier from about 2015 to 2017. So she has not spoken publicly about her membership in People of Praise. She wasn't asked about it at the Supreme Court at her nomination, at her confirmation hearing. She had been asked about her religion in previous confirmation and for a federal appeals court, and had said that she would not put her religious beliefs before the rule of law. However, these former members that I talked to who have suffered abuse are concerned. They're concerned that the way she was raised, the way they know they were raised, they're concerned that that might affect her views on cases involving sexual assault, involving gender equity, because at least in their view, you know, women are subservient to some degree to men. And the group professes that, you know, they believe in equality. But as I said earlier, their board is made up of all men. And so one of the issues is, where can girls go if they are victimized, if so much of the leadership in the community is male?
Very quickly before we let you go, has People of Praise responded at all?
Well, they have. You know, they are doing this investigation. They've hired lawyers. They you know, have professed. How should I say this? They have apologized in a way for the fact that what happened to these women. But what they haven't done is claimed, you know, we didn't handle it correctly, or we should have done this differently. They haven't taken responsibility in a way that these alleged victims would like to see. And they would also like to see more reforms put in place that hopefully would prevent people from being victimized, or if they are, from having sort of a safe way to report that abuse, and that to make sure that the abusers are held accountable.
Beth Reinhard, thank you very much.
Thank you.